What's up everyone? Been a while since I talked about in-game strategy in Pokemon, so I figured today I'd talk about the single biggest and most important strategy there is when you're playing a battle on Pokemon, which is going to be win conditions. Or more specifically, how to spot win cons so you can take advantage of them. Before we fully get into the swing of things, I want to clarify what exactly I mean when I talk about win cons. Because depending on who you're talking to, some people consider their strong sweepers to be their win cons. Or even something more abstract, like maybe they consider their win con to be, I wear down my opponent with hazards. Something like that. But to be clear, when I talk about win cons, I mean when you're playing a game against an opponent and you're finding a path to victory through whatever means. So this can mean you can get a Dragon Dance up with your Dragonite and you can notice that it can sweep your opponents. It can mean that your opponent can't break through your walls, it's eventually gonna get worn down by status or hazards, or hell, even in some scenarios, if your opponent doesn't have anything to beat your Ferrothorn can be a win con, despite seeming like the exact opposite of an offensive sweeper. That's why when I talk about win cons today, it's not gonna be just talking about offensive playstyles, but it's even gonna apply to things like balance and stall, because you need to be able to note your best paths to victory and be able to play around this. Now, I'll admit it's generally easier to explain with offense because you can look at a team like this, for example, and a team like this, and pretty easily look at the two and say, okay, so once Jellicent's knocked out, Blaziken can just sweep the rest. Easy peasy. But more subtle win cons aren't as easy to point out. Like, oh, maybe my opponent's entire team is really weak to hazards in general, and I can block my opponent's rapid spinner with my ghost type. So then it becomes a case of, as soon as I knock out the enemy Dragapult, which threatens this ghost type, I'll be able to slowly chip away at them with hazards. So in this case, this becomes my win con. But that's all well and good. It's one thing to talk about win conditions. I can just give you a million examples, but the question is, how do we spot these win cons? And if you're a newcomer and you don't know how to find these, what's the process of doing so? Because if anything, me saying that there's multiple different types of win cons and that it applies to defensive teams as well as offensive teams, that should be overwhelming all of a sudden. Like, oh my gosh, I don't have to just look at sweepers. I have to look at all of these Pokemon too. That's crazy, right? Because there is, after all, a lot to consider. So once again, where do we start when we're looking for a win con? So broken down to its simplest form, win conditions are just matchups. People who follow this channel for a while are going to roll their eyes at me sounding like a broken record here, but I'm not going to stop because I think this is so important to understanding competitive Pokemon. Knowing how each one of your Pokemon matches up versus your opponents and know who would win if they come into a 1v1 fight is one of the most core aspects of spotting win cons in really almost every interaction in Pokemon. This way of thinking helps you go, oh, okay, so my Garchomp has a ton of bad or mediocre matchups in this battle. I can use it a little more carelessly now, because it's likely not going to be a win con. And on the other hand, I can look at that same team and notice, holy crap, the Zapdos is going to be amazing versus every single Pokemon but Blissey. So it looks like knocking out Blissey so that my Zapdos can clean up is now my win con for this game. That's why when I'm playing, I take so long to choose my lead matchup. I've talked about it in a full video right here, but taking an extra 30 seconds before choosing your lead matchup will not only help you get your game started on the right foot and give you a really good opening game plan, but it also gives you a first look at your matchup versus your opponents. If I go, holy shit, my Scarf Hydreigon is about to go in versus my opponent, it looks great at opening lead matchup, then great, that's that first little glimpse at how the matchups are going to work out, and I keep that in mind for the rest of the match. If my Scarfer is a Terrakion instead, I'm maybe not going to like it in a lead matchup in this case at all. I can do a lot of damage, sure, but it's not going to OHKO the opponents before they smoke them right back in return. However, it's here that I should mention that if you take the time to look at how your Pokemon do at lead matchup, you're still not done yet, because Pokemon matchups are more than just how they look at team preview. They're actually going to be in flux from now to the end of the game. It's just like when you listen to the pro Smash Bros player Leffen talk about the Jigglypuff Fox matchup in Melee. Because when he's playing Jigglypuff and the Puff is around 55%, he starts to look for up throw up air, because that's the percent where it starts to kill. And when the Puff's at 70%, he's looking to start punishing with up smash. And finally, when the Puff's at 120% or more, the Fox can finish the stock with back air. So the matchup is changing completely for Leffen and how he plays it depending on the percent of the Puff. This is the same principle you should be using with your matchups in Pokemon. That Terrakion I mentioned earlier, I mean, sure, it's pretty lousy as a lead matchup, but if we come back to it later in the game with a bit of chip damage on everyone, maybe some key matchups are weakened like that Seismitoad, and you know, what do you know? This thing is looking primed to 6-0 our opponent with a huge sweep. Once again, this is why you should be trying to learn matchups with your Pokemon, because having that information from lots of practice and admittedly using the same team over and over can keep you fluid and adaptable in the game, as you know every matchup off by heart, bang, just like that. Because sure, maybe that Hydreigon was looking amazing versus your opponent, but what do you know, he sold out to stop it with his Clefable, and the second that Clefable was brought so low, there should be a light that's stinging in your head and going, hold on, maybe Hydreigon's not so good anymore, but Terrakion all of a sudden is extremely useful now. But if that changes later on down the road, maybe that Clefable gives itself a wish or heals or whatever, that light that dinged in your head should be turning back off. Again, you need to be in flux, you need to be flexible as the conditions of the match change. And a bit of a tangent here, but this is another reason why I try not to rely on Showdown's battle calculator too much for this exact reason. Because not only is being able to calculate stuff in your head a little bit cooler if I'm doing a live, for example, but it also simplifies your process for coming up with game plans on the fly. I keep coming back to the example from this specific game, but let's say that I'm at this point in the game right here where I need to decide if I'm willing to lose my Hydreigon versus my opponent. Again, I know that my Hydreigon's got a good matchup versus my opponent, so I'm kind of reluctant to pull the trigger. But let's say beforehand, there's two paths I can do, right? Just kind of head calc and kind of map it out in my head, or B, if I intricately calculate everything beforehand in the calculator. The second would probably look more like this. I see this, I go to the calculator, and I plug in my Pokemon first. I go Hydreigon, Nasty Plot, I go Fable, Utility, we'll make this Bidef, just to give it the most generous stats possible. Make that Calm. The Hydreigon Nasty Plotted, so it's at +2. And we see that, yes, again, it's very likely not going to knock it out, and Clefable will be able to OHKO it with Moonblast afterwards. So then it opens the field. We go, okay, we know that for sure. Okay, so what about Terrakion afterwards? Because everybody is very low afterwards. Can we get that Terrakion sweep afterwards? So we get that Clefable, and it's probably at like 12%, so we go to 12%. We go to our Terrakion. Can Swords Dance knock it out? And we have this Choice Scarf too. All this stuff's going in. And actually, hey, I haven't even done this yet because it's just a local game, but let's say I do this, and the timer's on now. So the timer's only giving you about 120 seconds per turn. So I see all that, and I go, okay, I gotta, so there's no way Terrakion can't take it out from this range. That's fantastic. What about Corviknight? Okay, I'll go to Corviknight. Corviknight, it's looking like, yes, if it's at 35%, okay, that's great. What about Seismitoad? Seismitoad is... Stone Edge is going to be close, so I have to close combat at that point.
That's very interesting. Now it gets a 50-50 with Dragapult, where either the Stone Edge
is knocking it out, or the Seismitoad actually, hold on, I don't even know that. It's the Dragapult now. So it's the Dragapult damage. Stone Edge.
Whereas if I'd done that exact same scenario in my head and trusted my head calcs a little bit, I can quickly look at the matchup and go, okay, you know, Hydreigon's probably not going to be able to beat the Clefable 1v1. But, you know, shit, after that, things open up completely for my Terrakion. Because I can just look right in front of me. I don't have to calculate everything. I just look in front, mouse over all these Pokemon and see, okay, I can knock out Corviknight probably. It's going to be close to nothing else knocking out Seismitoad. Clefable's definitely down at this range. Rotom, I definitely love that matchup with the Rock move. Dragapult, again, with the Rock move, that'd be fantastic. You know, and I can still swap around the Conkeldurr afterwards. So, boom, let's do it. Now, that was an overdramatic example because I just kind of made that up in my head, but you still understand what I mean because that's how it feels for me, where if I'm over-relying on the calc, which is, don't get me wrong, a stupidly amazing tool, very useful. You should definitely be using at least a little bit to inform your decision-making. But if you over-rely on it and you spend too much time in it and all of your knowledge and decision-making comes based on how these things work out, you can find yourself in a lot of trouble. Whereas if you rely on your head calcs and you rely on your own personal knowledge of matchups to spot these win cons, you're in a much better position. This allows you to form game plans that work on the wide macro scale of the game that you can kind of go to and rely on over the course of the game. Whereas the battle calculator tends to only help you with the immediate turn in front of you and helps you fixate on this turn right now. A word I like to use when I describe this, even if it's not a perfect application of the phrase, is heuristic, which refers to a mental shortcut to solve problems quickly. So a real world example of heuristics could be your times tables, for example. So if you ask me what 8 times 7 is, I'm not going to mentally count them up and go, okay, 8, 16, 24, 32, because back in elementary school, I memorized heuristically that it's 56. 8 times 7, 56. I just know that. I don't have to count it. I just know. Similar to I just know that Hydreigon beats Seismitoad. Sure, there's like intricacies. I don't want you to toxic, whatever, but I just know Seismitoad loses to Hydreigon. Got it. And now when you ask me what something bigger and more difficult, like 7 times 48 is, I can use that heuristic knowledge as a foundation and go, okay, well, 7 times 8 is 56. I know that. And we can add that 56 to 7 times 40, which is 280. Which we can add together to get 336. So that whole process is easy enough mentally when I had those heuristics to use as a foundation. But if I didn't know my timetables off by heart, it would be way harder. I have to write it down beforehand. I'd probably get a little bit lost. The same works for Pokemon matchups. And this is why I recommend you stick with one team and really learn it backwards and forwards so you get that matchups down. Instead of going to the calc to check every single matchup, I can just go, okay, again, I know Seismitoad beats my Terrakion, so I know it's a no-go. But Hydreigon beats that, So maybe if I drag click on this, I can do this, and if I do this afterwards, and you can form these more complex game plans just at the top of your noggin. So all this is just a way to reinforce my soapbox rant that matchups are really everything in Pokemon. And while they're daunting at first, I get it, it's kind of scary. If you just take your time and do it by a one-by-one process to learn them, you can really jump up your skill and maybe even improve your understanding of the game. So now, instead of mashing your setup move on your setup sweeper every single time and being frustrated by your opponent always seeming to wall you no matter what you do, you can instead look at your enemy's team and instantly see a path to victory. And after you see that path, you can learn maybe how to wade through the shifting seas of that wincon throughout the end game. Because if you ask me what the most fun part of battling is in Pokemon, it's that exact same sensation of having a game plan and as things change, being able to adapt to it and still see it through to the end. So if you want to have some more success and even maybe a little bit more fun in your Pokemon games, I'd recommend you keep an eye out for these wincons and the matchups that make them up. But with all that said, I'm going to sign off for today. I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you did, likes and subscriptions are a huge help to the channel's growth, so please consider. Otherwise, that's going to do it for me today. See you next time.